I'm all about honesty. And I've got to be honest, today's book, A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson, is my newest obsession. I had not planned on fitting it into my Halloween lineup. I have read a lot of bad books recently. And this one, let me see if I can put a little graphic in here. This one has restored my faith in writers all over the world. I had been waiting for this book and its successor, Good Girl, Bad Blood, for many a moon. I loved this book so much, people. This tells you a lot. I bought it on audiobook. I bought it on ebook. I bought Good Girl, Bad Blood on audiobook. I bought Good Girl, Bad Blood on ebook. And then I placed a pre-order for the third book in the series. It's just amazing. Granted, where I am right now in Good Girl, Bad Blood, I think I like A Good Girl's Guide to Murder a little bit more, but we'll see what the end result is when I get to the end of the book. So yeah, let's backtrack and talk about A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. Can you say that 10 times fast? A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, 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 yeah. The premise is the main character, Pippa, is doing her capstone project. And for me, this was one of my detractors because I didn't have to do a capstone project. I didn't have to do senior thesis. All I had to do to graduate from high school was earn the grades. I didn't have any added projects or requirements to graduate high school. And so I didn't quite understand how this fit in with her project. Da, 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 da. I need to get some waiting room music. What I'm coming from right now, Pippa is doing a capstone project for school, for her senior year, and she is doing it, says the courses of study or areas of interest to which the topic relates: English, journalism, investigative journalism, criminal law, and the working title is research into this missing persons case from their town. The thesis, the hypothesis, question, statement, blah, 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 is a report on how print, televised, and social media have become key players in police investigation, and using this case study, the implications of how the press presented the accused and his guilt. So she is going to interview missing persons experts. She's going to interview local journalists. She's going to use newspaper articles, interview people of the community, use textbooks and articles on police procedure, psychology, and the role of media. Then the one thing the teacher says is don't talk to the families. Ethically, don't talk to the families. I didn't quite understand how the rest of the novel fell in line with her capstone project, because to me, this was an excuse for her to ultimately solve the mystery behind Andy Bell's death. And it was her way of getting people to talk to her rather than she legitimately wanted to do a capstone project on the influences that media can have on an investigation. And then of course, so I'm glad that I reread this because it was something I wasn't sure if I'd gotten right. So the deal is the case that she wants to investigate. A local girl named Annie Bell had disappeared. It was assumed that her boyfriend, Sal Singh, had murdered her. And then days after that, he is found dead of suicide. Her body is never found, but he is vilified by the community and his family is made outcast by them. It's been 4 or 5 years on, and they still look at this family as guilty, even though there's no evidence that Andy's actually dead, except for the fact that she hasn't shown up in 5 years. One of the first things, literally, I think the first chapter, what does Pippa do? She goes to the sing house, which is when I was like, did I mishear what was going on? Like, is she allowed to talk to the sings, but not the bells? And so my overarching question throughout this book, because it is predicated on her project, everything she's doing is in the name of her senior project. But she never once seems concerned that she's gonna screw up and have to start her project all over again. And she comes across as both a rule follower and a rule breaker. And my initial impression of her is, girl's got nerves of steel, but she wants to do things right. She wants to succeed. She wants to get her A. So why is it that the first person she's going to talk to is someone her teacher has forbidden her to talk to? Because if it's found out that she had contact with this guy, then everything is shot. She can't get through her investigation without people finding out that these two have teamed up, despite the outline of what she is trying to achieve. She wants to figure out what happened to Andy Bell. Now, I gotta tell you, when I first started this, I thought Andy was a boy, which, funny enough, for the next book, I thought that the missing person was a girl when it's a boy. So, androgynous names, they'll do it to you every time. What had happened is Andy was supposed to pick her parents up from a party and she never showed up. The police thought that her boyfriend did it because the alibi that he gave them was negated by the friends he was supposed to have been with. He kills himself a couple days later and everybody says, well, it's because of his guilty conscience. But Pippa, her memories of Sal were of a very different kind of person. And so she couldn't reconcile her memories of him with the reputation he has been given. She goes to his house and she starts to talk to his brother. Naturally, the first thing the brother does is tell her to go away. He doesn't believe her intentions. She eventually convinces him, I'm legit. I'm trying to prove your brother was innocent. They go about talking to people, putting clues together, and going here, there, and everywhere until eventually we get our answer. What I loved most about this book is all the twists and turns, all of the natural suspicions, and then the way that the investigation would then shift. So you went in a natural yet unexpected direction. Okay, I gotta take this out. The headband's not working. Neither's my hair. Big spoiler here. Oh, my alfalfa. My bangs just getting really long and I don't know what to do with myself. Big spoiler here. I had figured out one of the murderers. I hadn't expected there to be two, which I loved. And so what the deal is that Andy had a little sister named Becca. Andy was a mean girl and she had gotten involved in drug dealing and she had sold roofies multiple times to a classmate who had drugged classmates and raped them. And Becca was one of his victims. She didn't really know what happened, but she knew something had happened. She is able to track down the source, and that would be Andy. But when she confronts Andy is like, suck it up, you should just be grateful somebody wanted to sleep with you. Ultimately, what Becca does is she knocks Andy down, she hits Andy. Somehow Andy ends up on the floor and she'd already had a previous head injury that night. And so, she just basically starts convulsing and vomiting and she chokes on her own vomit. That is Andy's killer. Sal's killer was somebody entirely different. And this is the one that I had figured out. Because Andy, she was beautiful and she was popular. And that's how everybody saw her. They did not see the mean girl side of her. But what was going on was she'd come from a bad home. Like, her dad was emotionally and verbally abusive. And so she's in this relationship with Sal, but she desperately wants to get out of their town. So she begins a relationship with one of their teachers. And their teacher, Mr. Ward, also happens to be Pippa's best friend's dad. And so obviously when we learn that he killed Sal, Pippa's devastated. She's like, how in the world am I going to tell Kara? Andy gets involved with Mr. Ward, and eventually he says, this just isn't going to work. Like, this is wrong. And she blackmails him because she's thinking she can use him because he used to teach at Yale. So she's like, I can blackmail him into getting me into Yale, which is where Sal is going to go. Things don't work out, and they have a confrontation. He pushes her, she hits her head, and so this is the initial head injury she had, so that when she got home, things happened the way they happened. But Mr. Ward, believing that Sal would be the best patsy, forces him to take sleeping pills, suffocates him, and then hangs him in the woods. So it's supposed to look like a suicide. This is something that I had already put together because Pippa kind of puts together a timeline of events. And early on, we learn that Mr. Ward, there's two daughters. There's Kara and there's Naomi. And we learn that he had stayed home the day that Sal killed himself, and that Naomi had stayed home. That was my first clue that something was up with Mr. Ward. It shouldn't have been a clue, but I thought the fact that they were both home was kind of suspicious. Like, I thought that was just a little too convenient. More than suspicious, it was convenient. Anything could happen, or there could be any reasoning behind them staying home. And it's possibly because they're involved, and what's the best way for Mr. Ward to be involved? He was involved with Andy. And, there's no mother in the picture. She had died of cancer some years earlier. What I hadn't expected was Andy to actually be dead, because we have no proof that she is dead. What Pippa ends up discovering is Mr. Ward had been claiming to be tutoring 3 days a week. As I mentioned, his wife had passed away sometime earlier, and she had come from a wealthy family, so they didn't need money. So why would he be tutoring 3 days a week? She follows him, and she discovers him, in an apron and oven mitts, cooking up a storm. And so I'm thinking, all right, she's gonna get to this house, and he's going to be in a relationship with Andy, and they've just been hiding it, and this was the way that they were going to get around any problems. Andy was going to have a couple kids under her belt, and they were just going to be this one big happy family. Or maybe not. Maybe Andy was behind it all, because Pippa has begun to receive threatening messages telling her to stop investigating. And so I'm thinking Andy's behind all of it because she doesn't want her picket fence ruined. What happens is Mr. Ward had been holding hostage. Well, I say holding hostage, but that's just a very loose term for what happens. After he and Andy get into their scuffle and she hits her head, he goes to get a first aid kit. When he returns, she's gone, and he doesn't see her. So a couple months later, he sees this girl walking down the road, and he's like, oh, that must be Andy. And we're given the information that this girl was a drug addict. So we're like, obviously something happened to Andy in those intervening months, and this must be her. That's basically what he did, is he picked this girl up off the street, and he nursed her back to health. He detoxed her, and now he's just been keeping her in the attic of this house, but he's fitted it out with everything she needs, so it's not like she's in want for anything. So then Pippa climbs the stairs, only to realize this girl is not Andy Bell. And we learn it's just some other girl who'd had drug problems and is mentally deficient. She has like the mental aptitude of a 12-year-old, and she legitimately thinks she's Andy Bell. In the end, he goes to jail for murder. So I didn't see that coming. I did and I didn't. Like, I legitimately thought Andy was somewhere and somehow Mr. Ward was involved with her location. I don't know how I feel about that twist. Personally, I thought my idea was better. That ultimately Andy was the bad guy. She was the manipulator. She was the one trying to get Pippa off the case because she doesn't want to be found out, and it didn't turn out that way. In terms of the threatening notes that Pippa was receiving, she was getting them from both parties, and what she realized is that there were two different people sending her threatening messages, one with ill intent and one just trying to get her to back off. Becca was the one with ill intent. And this is something that I just didn't care for this part of the novel. I like dogs, but I'm not necessarily a dog lover. It takes a lot for me to really love a dog. My apathy towards dogs just disconnects me from this little scenario. Pippa had been walking her dog and somebody steals it. What they tell her to do is destroy all of her evidence and they'll give her dog back, and then the dog dies. This doesn't play so much of a part in this book as it does in the next one, but I found her reaction to the dog a bit heavy-handed, a bit over the top. Thankfully, she was as smart as I'd hoped she'd be, because that's how she was depicted throughout the novel, and she had backups. But she completely destroys her computer to get a dog back. And this is something where I know so many of you are going to be like, Beth, you are the most callous, uncaring, heartless person in the entire world. If my dog had been dog-napped, I would have done anything to get him back. All right, great. Like, you would have loved this. You would have connected with it. You would have understood exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. But for me, you can get a new dog. But that computer, how are you going to explain that to your parents? And depending on the kind of finances you have, how are you going to get a new computer? So I guess that shows where my mindset's at. You're not going to find me as an old cat lady, that's for sure. The other thing that I could have done without, and this is another matter that plays heavier into Good Girl, Bad Blood, is Pippa's friend group. She has two best friends, Kara and Lauren, and then they have a trio of boys that kind of hang out with them. Kara, I was cool with because she became relevant to the story. She was connected to the story. I really enjoyed the struggle and the guilt that Pippa battled because her actions were going to hurt her best friend, whether she meant them to or not. And so I liked how for me, I'm thinking logically, you gotta solve a murder, kid. But emotionally, I'm like, you're gonna ruin your friendship. She's never gonna forgive you. How are you gonna get past this? And so I liked Kara. Lauren, honestly, was a bit character. And then these boys were even less than that. So I didn't understand why they rated a mention, except that in the next book. So they kind of serve as a stepping stone here so that they can mean something for the next book. Honestly, if we've only given passing mentions of them as her friends, I would have been satisfied for the next book. Because if even in the next book, only one of the boys from that trio gets any face time. So I guess we'll see what happens in the third book. But I thought that her friends got in the way because there were so many of them, yet they were completely unnecessary. And as I said, as of right now, only one of them is playing any kind of role in Good Girl, Bad Blood. And the two of them, I we'll see by the time I finish the book how things pan out. But I'm very confused as to who they are, because in the next book, Connor, the boy that comes into play, his brother, Jamie, who I thought was a girl, goes missing. His best friend is this dude named Ant, who is part of the trio of boys, and he has begun dating Lauren, who is part of the trio of girls in this book. And so in the next book, both of them are completely oblivious or uncaring towards the fact that Connor's brother has been missing for a week. And then we get to a point where Pippa is accused of making the whole thing up. And they're coming at her like, well, it looks like you really are. So I'm like, how can Lauren be her best friend? How can Ant be Connor's best friend? And them come at these two in such a callous way. So we'll see how things end up, but I don't like the portrayal of them having this close bond, only for them to turn on Pippa and Connor partway through the novel. I'm like, it doesn't make sense to me. But A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. We have this huge cast of characters that didn't need to be there. And then we had this other girl named Nat. So she was another victim of, so Max is the guy who had been roofing the classmates. And so she was not only another one of his victims, but she was also the target of Andy's cyberbullying, because Nat was just as pretty as Andy, but Andy couldn't have that. So she had to take Nat down a peg or two, and she made Nat's life miserable. And then eventually Nat gets in trouble with the law because she gets to college and her roommate is doing things that are very similar to what Andy had been doing to her, and she kind of snaps. Pippa is suspecting not only Nat, but Nat's brother of being the murderers, because what Andy had initially used against Nat to get what she wanted was, she said that Nat's brother had slept with her, and because of the ages, it was statutory rape. They both had motive, so me, as the viewer, from Pippa's point of view, I'm like, but she's got facts on her side. It's nothing personal. She's just trying to do her job or, complete her project. And so Nat, she annoyed me because I felt like she was a little too angry when she doesn't even know Pippa. And I think Pippa insinuated that Nat and her brother could have been involved in the murder, but I didn't feel like Nat gave Pippa enough of a chance to really explain anything so that she could have an opinion one way or another. And then her brother, he is on the police force, and apparently he's a known philanderer. And I guess maybe Nat told him, or maybe somehow when Pippa spoke to him, he got the impression that she thought he could be involved with Andy's murder, and so now he's on the defensive, and then that carries into Good Girl, Bad Blood. I also question what kind of policeman he is, because in both books, the police aren't shown in the best of light, and you really get the impression that he might be a dirty cop. And so I wanted something from him that was a redeeming quality, like maybe he defended himself against Andy's accusation of rape. Like maybe he didn't actually sleep with her, although we get the sense that he probably did, just because he has a habit of cheating on his wife and doing things he shouldn't be doing. We had Pippa's friend group. We had Andy, we have Sal, we have Ravi, who is Sal's brother, we have Becca, we have Max, we have the drug dealer, we have Nat, we have her brother, we have so many characters. We could have pared things down a little bit. Granted, having a lot of characters also kept me guessing, And that was what shone in this novel, was you never knew where we were going to go. And like I said, it was always unexpected, but it also always made sense. And so I loved how one thing led to another, which led to another, which led to another. Even Mr. Ward or Becca, learning that they were the murderers. This is something that I've complained about in other book reviews, is where the murderer comes out of nowhere and you're like, where did that come from? I didn't see it coming. This one, the breadcrumbs were there. Like I said, I picked up on the fact that Mr. Ward was not in school on the day Sal died. What could that mean? And so there were just little things, questions and answers that could have been true, but they could have been false. With Becca, she is working at the newspaper office, and she is working on an article to save an old farmhouse. What we learn is she's trying to save this farmhouse because that's where she buried Andy's body. And so it makes total sense that as she is working at this newspaper, she would want to lobby for something. She's just lobbying for it for the wrong reasons. So I really enjoyed how nothing really came out of nowhere. You just had to know. It's kind of like doing a murder board, and you see the strings leading to here and there. You just have to know how to look at the right strings. And so I was supremely impressed by Holly Jackson's writing. Will say the audiobooks, they're pretty good, although there are definite times that I don't care for the narrator. I don't like the emotion that she puts behind some of her characters, because instead of sounding strong, they sound weak. And speaking of the audiobooks, I was recently talking to a friend about full cast audiobooks, because she was saying how she enjoys listening to an audiobook that has different narrators. And I had mistook that for my experience with the Alana series, where it is a legitimate full cast audio. It is not, oh, the book has 3 narrators, so there are 3 different actors voicing those narrators. No, I took it as each individual character gets their own actor. You'd think it'd be good, but I'm telling you, with the Alana series, not good. When I heard that, or I learned that this was going to be a full cast audio, I was like, what am I getting myself into? I'm so grateful that I didn't buy this book, that it's just on loan from the library. But it was done so well. It was done the way I thought that Tamara Pierce's book should have been done. Like I mentioned in the beginning, Pip, girl had nerves. And I loved that she wasn't afraid. But eventually, towards the end, I did start to wonder why she was so fearless. Like when she's getting into the dark, when she's getting into the gritty, when she's getting all of these threatening notes, why is she not a bit more concerned for her safety? Why is she not second guessing her decision to do certain things and put herself in certain situations? I think that would have helped me to connect with her more, to see that she's like, I think I'm getting close to something. Like when she follows Mr. Ward to the house to find Andy, she goes by herself. Granted, she calls the police, but what she says is, this is the situation. I'm going in. I'm not waiting for you. I'm going in. So you better hurry up. And I'm like, Pippa, seriously. And so that is when I have disconnect with the next novel. Is, yes, she throws herself in head first into this investigation. And when she confronts Becca again, we get another solo confrontation. And then Becca uses what was left of their hypnol to drug Pippa. And then Pippa is overdosing and ends up in the hospital, which we don't really see. But in the next novel, she is hesitant to take up the case because of how involved she got in the Andy Bell case. I would have liked to see her afraid. There were moments when she would get too close, like after she decided to do it by herself, that she was like, okay, all right, like, whoa. Because she never really had any of those second guessing moments, when we get to the next book and she's so hesitant to take on another case, I thought that was out of character. I was really surprised how far she took this investigation. I loved it. But in terms of a teenage girl who's 17 years old, I was like, is that really the behavior of a 17-year-old? And speaking of all of her investigations, there she in speaking with Max, who is someone that I won't talk about in this book so much because he's more of a player in the next book where I'm having issues. But so she's talking to him, and every time she talks to him, he's kind of lying about something. He's omitting facts. And she realizes maybe there's more to his story and his involvement with Andy than he's letting on. In trying to hunt Andy down, trying to figure out certain things and annotations in Andy's journal and diary or whatnot, she comes to this old inn. And so she gets to this inn, and the owner is an older woman whose husband has already died, and they're so dinosaur that all of their records were on paper or on his computer, but now that he's gone, they don't have any of that. But she's looking at the picture of Andy, and she's like, well, I know that girl. Not I knew that girl. Not that girl was here. But that girl essentially still comes here. And so I'm thinking, ooh, the plot thickens. Because one of Andy's hypotheses was Andy was still alive. And so I'm like, all right, we're getting somewhere. Only for neither Pippa nor Ravi to suspect that maybe the woman isn't deluded, like maybe she is not suffering her bout of dementia, but she actually has seen Andy recently. Like, I thought that would have been such a great curveball. And then the nephew or the grandson comes in, he's like, no, I've never seen that girl. And I'm like, well, he could be lying too. Like, because we know that Andy was involved with an older man, and so maybe this is the older man. I don't really know how he came into the picture, but maybe he's the guy, and he's hiding it or something. And it turns out that the woman was just really mixing things up. She hadn't seen Andy in years, and yeah, the grandson was right. Like, he'd never seen her before. And so that was just one avenue that if we're looking at this as just a bunch of routes, of train tracks, where, you know, like there's switchbacks, there's this and that and the other, where it just comes to a dead stop. We get this huge lead up to this being key information, only for nothing to come of it. I got far more excited than I should because of the way it was built up. One other thing, and I'm just going to end here, is basically everybody in this town has a secret, you know? And what we learned from Naomi, who I could not stand the narration for her, but we're not going there. I was initially thinking Naomi was involved because she and Sal had been best friends, and then he starts dating Andy, and so I'm like, oh, well, maybe Naomi did something out of jealousy or whatever. But what happened was she, Max, who was the rapist, and then two more of their friends, not involving Sal, they had gotten drunk at a party. Max claimed he could drive when he really couldn't. They hit somebody, ran off, then the guy ends up a paraplegic or a quadriplegic. He ends up paralyzed in some capacity. And so this is the big secret that they're carrying around. And this is what causes them to lie to the police about Sal's alibi, which makes him look even more guilty, which makes him look like he would have the time to intercept Andy, kill her, hide her body. So this is another one of those moral dilemmas, because, and it's all for the sake of protecting Kara, which I love because as black and white as I am, life is not black and white. Pip has to figure out what's right, what's wrong. Kara's mother's already dead. Her dad's gonna go to prison. Does she dare let anybody know about what Naomi was involved with? She ends up deciding, even though Max is complete douche, it's not worth letting anybody know Naomi was involved with it. Naomi is able to get past all that and not suffer any consequences. And so yes, I love the fact that morals are not always black and white. Because it would have been a really difficult decision. Like, legally, yes, they needed to be punished. But who would have been punished most in this scenario? Kara. Kara would have lost everything through no fault of her own. And so I'm hoping to see some justice at the end of Good Girl, Bad Blood with stuff particularly pertaining to Max, but we'll find out. Going into Good Girl, Bad Blood, I was going to say you don't necessarily need to read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder in order to get it. But the further we get into it, the more references we get to this book. So where I think on the whole you could get by, and she does a decent job tying things together or giving you just enough information, you could get by with just reading Good Girl, Bad Blood as a standalone. But I would recommend Good Girl's Guide to Murder, not only because it's fantastic, but it gives you a lot of context and a lot more understanding. If you've seen my reviews of the Wendy Darling series, I did that one completely out of order. I started with the last book, and I remember having a hard time getting through it because I felt like there was so much that I didn't get. No matter how hard Colleen Oakes tried to give me the information I needed, I just couldn't slot the pieces into place. And so I feel like that could be a situation here where you're like, I kind of get it, but I don't really get it. What is the significance, or why is it so significant? That is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. It is a fantastic whodunit with a lot of twists and turns, and on the whole, A++++. I will see you next time. Bye.